So let's get started. We have a very important and very meaty conversation for today, and I really appreciate all of you taking the time to talk today. I want to pin my video. Okay, so thank you all for joining today. I'm going to attempt to admit people while we talk, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time, and I appreciate you joining a conversation that I think is not happening nearly as much as it needs to be happening on every level of our communities. And that is that we're not providing the right kinds and not sufficient amounts of support to our small businesses. And we're particularly not doing it in a way that is inclusive. We created programs that are first come, first serve. And that doesn't serve a lot of the needs for a lot of our business owners who may not have the paperwork right in front of them, or may not have a history of loans, or may not be able to take on new debt. And I know I've heard from many of you who have joined today over LinkedIn and over email and in Facebook and on the phone with many of you, in fact, over the last couple of weeks, that it's just not enough, and it's not the right things, and it's not how we're gonna get there. And so I really, for those of you who have joined any of the last ones, I'm gonna give you a brief overview of who I am and how we run this. And then we're just going to dive into the meat of the conversation. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Ilana Preuss. I have a consulting firm called Recast City. I work with communities to bring small scale manufacturing businesses into the center of business strategy and also into downtowns and redevelopment projects. These days, I've broadened my umbrella to say, well, you know what? It's not just about the product businesses. This is about all of our small businesses, and how do we save our small businesses during this crisis, during this not only pause in our economy, but really, as some have described, this black hole in our economy, because we don't know where the bottom is yet. And as I've been consuming information about the federal programs and a lot of the state and local programs that are working to support small businesses, and I'm super impressed at how quickly some of that got mobilized, it's become glaringly clear to me that we're doing it in a way that is not inclusive. That's certainly not equitable in any way. But even at the most basic level, we're not looking at ways to make sure that the assistance that we're putting out isn't reaching the demographic diversity of our business ownership community, or if it is, we have no way of documenting it yet. And so historically, we know that businesses owned by people of color, by women, by immigrants are less likely to get loans, are less likely to get government support, and are less likely to get qualified for these programs. So I don't see why that would be any different now. And so I think that means that we need to start looking at how do we structure programs in a really specific way to make sure we're reaching these populations. So I put together a piece that I have been thinking about a while, and want to just share some of the thoughts about that, and then share some of the resources that people have shared with me about models. And to me, the magic in all of this, for lack of a better term, is when we can find places that have figured out a model or some part of a model that we think we want to replicate that gets us there faster. And so that's what I want to try to do today, is share some of the models that people have shared with me, and then open up the conversation for people on this line to share models that they have identified, so, or that they're using, or that they created, because I want a way for us to get there faster. So, you know, I think when we think about this instinct to get the money out there fast, the instinct to just get assistance out there fast, it was fine as a first gut instinct, but now we need to do better. And we're now a couple weeks into some of how these new programs are putting out there, and there are tons and tons of problems with access, and actually very few people that are getting any of the funding out of it. So then the question becomes, how do we support our small businesses in an inclusive way? Which is actually the only way that we will be able to rebuild our economy after this crisis. If we don't create a method that allows us to be inclusive in the assistance, then we are going to have even greater inequities in our economy coming out of this crisis. And that's going to slow our economic recovery for many, many, many more years. Not only is it the right thing to do for people, it's the right thing to do for our economy. And I think it's important to acknowledge both of those. So I think that it really, to me, comes down to state and local leadership I think there are some things that can be done at the federal level, such as with the Paycheck Protection Program. We can inquire, or we can require reporting about the demographics of the business, so that we can see how much is going to different size businesses in different locations. I honestly, I feel like the banking rules might preclude us from collecting demographic information, but I am not a banking expert, so I'm not sure that's actually true. But if we could, it would be great to actually collect the demographic information about who's getting the funding, so that we could know if the funding is not representing our demographic diversity. So then we could create federal pools specific to those underrepresented populations of business owners, and make sure that we're pursuing outreach to reach those business owners specifically. I think we also need to send an equivalent amount of funds to local governments. And that really means asking local governments to focus on grants for small business survival over the next 3 to 6 months. Many communities access community development block grants. This might be a great way to do it. There's also this new municipal liquidity facility that came out of the last statement from the Federal Reserve. And if we have experts on that who want to share some ideas behind that, I'd welcome that. But more or less what that municipal liquidity facility said is that states and cities over 1 million and counties over 2 million can take bonds and sell bonds up to, I think, 20% of their revenue, jurisdiction's revenue from last year, and get that money fast from the Federal Reserve. And any jurisdiction smaller than that can work with their state to access that source of funding. So a state can apply, I think it's 20% of this whole state's revenue from last year, which could be an enormous amount of money. Unclear how that money gets repaid eventually, but it raised this enormous cap on bond measures and different ways that states can raise money to respond to this crisis. So our jurisdictions could work with the state to tap into that resource and create small business survival grants. And there are some models of that already out there that I want to talk about. But that also, we want to make sure that the funding goes to the demographic diversity of our communities, and that as states and as localities put out that kind of funding, they actually require that kind of transparency. We require that kind of reporting to see where the money is going. And I think that this is an important time to make sure that we are reaching our diverse business owners. And third, I think that it's important to look at our CDFIs. And I know I've talked about this before. This is my third Zoom call, having various conversations with some of you. And I appreciate my repeat participants. And for those of you who are new, you haven't heard me rant about this yet. But CDFIs, I think, are really a gem in this conversation, to be able to say these community development financial institutions are already at work in our communities, for the most part, reaching our most underserved business owners. And they are probably the best conduit to continue to reach those populations, because they're already known and trusted in many of our communities. So then how do we put more funding in with the CDFIs to expand their work, not only their operations and their capacity, which we know from seeing all of these systems crash across the country, like evidently people's banks have all crashed today because of the tax abatement that went into people's bank accounts, but also making sure that CDFIs can put out grants and have the backing behind that, because they already have the reach. If we look at some of what's going on at the local level and in the philanthropy community, there's a really interesting set of partnerships that are going on. And I just want to talk about a few of them to share what people have been sharing with me. The latest one that just got announced is from the Ford Foundation. It's a partnership with a whole bunch of foundations called Families and Workers, the Families and Workers Fund. And it's for businesses and nonprofits that are directly assisting people. And I think that's an interesting partnership to look at across philanthropy. There's also a partnership with between Goldman Sachs and the Community Reinvestment Fund in Rhode Island to get PPP-like loans out faster. And then there's a great example in Los Angeles where the city and the mayor's nonprofit partnered with MasterCard to create this vendor account, so that vendors who can't access all these other sources of funding actually have almost like an ID card where they can immediately get cash grant assistance. And because it's through this nonprofit, they can also attract additional donations and funding. There's one example that I also saw, I'm trying to find it while I'm talking, of the United Way, a regional United Way in Texas partnering with a set of local governments and Chamber of Commerce in Brazos Valley, that is the area around College Station, Texas, if you're trying to figure out your geography. That is also fundraising to provide grants to small businesses and nonprofits. Chicago has one where they've created a small business resiliency fund, and Louisville has one, and then there's the Connecticut one that's a 0% interest loan that has a forgiveness element to it. The amazing thing to me about all of these is how quickly they got up. The challenge is that a lot of them are all jammed up. They're all stuck because there isn't enough capacity behind it. So there's a technology question behind it of how do we open it up, which is one of the reasons I like the CDFIs, because that's already a dispersed network. But then we also have this question of, is the fund or is the instrument that's organizing the fund already focused on our underrepresented populations? Or is it a broader fund that has a carve out? And how is all of that working? And I think that's a really open question as to how we address that in our conversations and in our work at the city and state level. I have a whole bunch of other kinds of programs that I can talk about. A lot of places set up 0 interest loans or low interest loans. But I put those in a different category because I think a lot of businesses don't want to and can't take on more debt. Oh, and I just saw that people are waiting in the waiting room, sorry. They can't take on debt, and they don't have the capacity to take on debt. They don't have the documentation to take on debt. They can't put a personal guarantee behind it. For one reason or another, there's a lot of problems with that. And that's fine. I think that there are a lot of logical reasons why people don't want to take on debt or can't take on debt. And I think that there's this next question of this triage of the small grants and how much that can help. How can people, and the rollout of unemployment and how slow that's been in certain places and how horrible that's been in a lot of places. And then this third bucket, which is how do we help people figure out how to move forward? There's tons of reports talking about how this is not going to be a short thing, that online sales and online business and online communication is going to be what we need for a fairly long time. And for the sake of my teenagers that are not too far away, I won't say how long that is. But I think we need to realistically look at these business owners and also say, okay, we're gonna stem the tide of the awful. And now we also need to figure out how to help you fundraise about making the changes. So what technical assistance can we provide? How do we fundraise around the technical assistance? What platforms can we create that these service businesses and product businesses can just plug into? How do we have to help people brainstorm? And it really is brainstorming. And I do this with my cohort of business owners that I work with. How do we help them brainstorm what people can need right now and how they can provide some of those things in a completely different way? And then helping tons of businesses that have never been online get online, as much hand holding as they need. So I think that's the other big question. And I know there are some amazing tools out there, and I've been trying to help promote some of them on LinkedIn also. But I think that's the other bucket that we need to start thinking about more. And the other bucket, the other bucket that I'm looking at is our smaller towns. And how do we look at a place or work with a place that had a weak economy before this and really figure out how to have this not completely kill that place? If any of you know me and my past work, I love places. I believe in places, and I believe places should be able to thrive, and the people who live there should be able to thrive. And so I look at places that are already under-resourced, both neighborhoods and small cities and towns, and look at, well, they're not going to be able to create grant programs like this if they don't have the resources. What can we do? How else do we get resources to that community and to the businesses there? Those are my big ideas. What I'd like to do now is actually open up for conversation, and don't just unmute yourself, but I'm going to tell you about how this works. The conversation works like this. What I'd like to do first is share ideas around how do we get inclusive resources to our small businesses. If you know of another kind of program, if you know of another kind of resource, I'd love for you to briefly share what that is in the chat. You can all access the chat. And then I'll call on you and I'll ask you to briefly share what that model is, what that program is, what is out there. And then we'll talk about the pivoting and how do we support people through that process. So we'll separate those two parts of the conversation. So everybody clear on that system, hopefully. Kennedy, you were the first one, you talked about the CDFIs. Can you unmute and talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to sort of second your call for the importance of CDFIs and reaching underserved communities. And I would put in the same word for community banks, especially in rural areas, but also in urban areas. And I've put in the chat just some quick stats that we put together this morning where we downloaded the SBA's new information about the Paycheck Protection Program loans they've made so far. And then looked at the population of each state, figured out how many dollars per capita they've awarded and how many grants per capita or loans. And then also looked at the presence of community banks. We haven't yet done a tally of CDFIs, but we're working on that because I have a feeling that we're going to find that they're very important in underserved areas with the PPP program, even though it's just rolling out. So, and obviously needs more oomph behind it.
Yeah, and when you have those numbers out, I'm happy to help echo it and yell it from the rooftops. Okay, thank you very much, Kennedy. Lee, you thoughts about under-resourced businesses and how we can get through to micro-lenders? Do you have a specific program that you've seen going on? Lee Elberson. I think we have more than one Lee.
Yes, right. So yeah, I work with a micro lending and mentoring group in Charlottesville, Virginia. And I think we've seen certainly sort of two stages to this support. I mean, I think in the short term, helping to deploy programs like PPP to very small businesses that, as you said, don't have the resources or the capital, sort of institutional capital to be able to apply for these loans. But I think, we're probably looking at a pretty long-term change in their business models. And so those funds will likely only get them through the next few months. So we're looking at programs that would help mentor these businesses and start thinking about pivot points and ways to change their business model so that they will survive the next 6 months to a year, assuming that maybe the changes are not permanent. So that's, I think that the easier part, and it's not that it's easy, is sort of deploying those resources. We already do microloans, and so we can certainly talk about forgiving loans and deploying $5,000, $10,000, $25,000 loans to lots of small businesses. I think mentoring is a much harder problem to solve because we need more human beings to be able to work with these businesses, and we need to find a way to come up with those hours to donate. So I don't know a solution to the second one, and the first one is still a difficult problem.
Right. And I think then on top of that is this question of how do we do it in an inclusive way, right? It's not just that we need to look at these two pieces. We have to think about how we're doing these two pieces and getting it out and finding the right partners to make sure that we are reaching the people in our different demographic pools. One of the things that I've seen from our work, so when we usually work with communities, we work with a community to find small scale manufacturing businesses. In most communities, they've never thought about them. they have no idea that they're there, and they're there. And so the first thing we do is we will go through a process to go find these businesses. And the second thing we do is say, okay, now go find them in a way that represents the demographic diversity of your community. And people say, well, we just don't know them. And we do it the same way. We say, you know, you have to go in and find your connectors. Who are the people who are already in those communities, who are known and trusted in different ways, who can help carry your message, who can be your messenger, who can bring the information in a way that is accessible to people into their communities. Because most of the time, whoever is trying to lead the effort may not be the right messenger, and certainly may not be doing it in the right way. And so I think we have to think in this time also about not only how we're doing each of these buckets, but who are we partnering with to get the information out there, and then to bring these business owners in a way that they feel comfortable and feel like they can trust the system. But Lee, I think your points are really, really good. I think that also, when we think about the pivot, I've been thinking about it in a really different way, actually. I think I was saying pivot today, but I've started thinking about it like we build a house. When somebody rehabs an old house, sometimes we have to strip it down to the studs and redo everything, right? Other than the basic foundation and the basic structure. And that might be what some businesses need to do in the new reality, is that it's not a pivot, it's really a completely reshaping of the way it interacts with the whole rest of the world. I think that's going to be hard, but I do think that there are some really interesting resources out there. And a lot of times the barrier that I see is that people who are small business owners are overwhelmed by the number of resources that are out there. So a service provider or a local government or an economic development authority being able to say, we are going to buy this service. We're going to pay for this service for you, this training, this e-commerce platform, whatever it is, and really handing people a how-to. Elizabeth, you say you're looking at a comprehensive place-based approach that includes helping a place-based partner create and execute a short and midterm and long-term recovery plan. You can unmute and tell us a little bit more about what you're thinking about.
Sure. So, I mean, I wanted to start by saying that I love what you mentioned. I love when you mentioned that we need to collect demographic information, because that's never done. But I think when we collect that, we'll see that this process hasn't been equitable for a number of reasons, which you started off talking about. So I think at LISC, what we're trying to think through is how to make sure that we're not only focusing on the places that are already, suffering, that have already experienced, decades of decay, but have, started to come back, that you're seeing businesses spread out, and how do you make sure that that success is, seen in the long term, but, making sure that we're not just, providing like some short-term wins, but setting places up for long-term success. And, right now the need is grants. The need will then become retooling. If we don't have a concentrated effort, so a group of businesses recover together and things are too dispersed, then you're never going to really see that spark to, attract some like long-term investment to a place. And so I think that just making sure that from the beginning we're investing in, supporting the local infrastructure to see a place through those different phases is going to be really important. And this is kind of the time to do that.
You cut out just at the end for me, but I heard everything up until the last sentence. You still there?
Yeah.
Okay. So I agree. I think that we are past the initial panic, which was last week. I mean, it does change really fast. I feel like the conversations that I'm having this week are completely different, and that your point about being a place-based economic development approach, I mean, I'm 1,000% behind that. That's all I live and do. But I do think that there's this interesting point that you added up, which is how do we create a cohort? I know you didn't use that word, but it's the way my brain thinks about it, is how do we create this group of small businesses that actually can thrive together? And we know from tech startup world, from tons of different programming, that cohort models are really essential because it's building people's personal business networks, and they all can rebuild together and they support each other. And we know this from research on different disasters like Katrina, that the business owners that had stronger personal networks were the ones that could survive better and could come back stronger. And so I do think that there's this really interesting question of how do we then take that idea, which I love, and then take the second idea of these connectors, right, that can really help us dive into target populations and say, okay, let's start building out these cohorts. They probably can't be more than 10 people at a time, right? Because you can't really have that in-depth dynamic with a larger group. And so then what is that network effect of having these series of cohorts in a place-based strategy? I think that's a fascinating question that I would love to work on. But I think that it's a great strategy to say with one community, okay, let's get the grants out. Let's figure out what our technical assistance tools will be. Mm-hmm. And now let's start setting up these cohorts and just going one by one by one by one it's a question of how many can you facilitate, right? Because it needs a facilitator, but that's really the only capacity limit on something like that. That's a great addition. Thank you. Bill, crowdfunding. I think that this is a great tool for what we need. And I have people reaching out to me who are still salaried saying, I want a way to help. And they can obviously opt into a grant pool like what United Way is doing in Texas, but they also could be part of a crowdfunding resource. So Bill, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think absolutely there's so much that's been said previously to this is really important. One of the things that we try to focus on at Project Crowd is being able to talk about what it looks like to build a local crowdfunding ecosystem. And what we mean by that is two different things. One is that crowdfunding comes in and it becomes local. It becomes a place where investors can come in and invest in small businesses, invest in small real estate deals, and be able to really help the community, bring a few of those dollars home from Wall Street and invest in their community. But also it means being able to build an ecosystem with all the other funders that you're talking about. The CDFIs, being able to connect with the foundations, with the government, and create a system where we are all there to help small businesses get access to technical assistance and to funding. One of the projects that we're going to roll out May 1st is an online training for people so they learn what crowdfunding is, how crowdfunding can be done. And then what we want to do is we want to be able to roll out local portals for people. Initially, we want those portals to be reward crowdfunding, and reward crowdfunding can be something that is immediate. And what I mean by that is we don't know when this is going to end, and we certainly don't know what the end is even going to look like. But one of the things that we can do is, small businesses, restaurants, those type businesses, what they can do is they can maybe sell coupons that you can redeem 6 to 7 months from now, but they can get the capital right now that they need. And as we look at this crowdfunding ecosystem further down the road, we can start to look at investment opportunities, investment crowdfunding, and maybe even community investment funds, where we can start this process and continue this process and look more long-term at what the sustainability is going to look like after this COVID-19 crisis has passed. So many small businesses have been underfunded for so long. I think what we're seeing is more of a magnifying glass than a crisis. Or the crisis has been going on for a long time and it's being magnified today. And if we don't create ecosystems that support small businesses, then, these small businesses are going to disappear after this crisis.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And I think that there's a great opportunity for people to also become, future revenue sharing partners through crowdfunding. And I think that that's potentially a really scary thing for small businesses that have never taken on any kind of investment. But I think it's a really exciting opportunity combined with the kind of gift certificate rewards side that you're talking about. Thank you, Bill. Another question that came in is really a different kind of inclusion question. And I want to make sure that we bring this up. And this is really about how different places have bottomed out with their economy. So Melinda posted a question about what about the small cities who don't have a funding source for small business assistance? How do we convince people to spend money on it? Small cities have been left out. And I'm going to give you a caveat because I've spoken to some small cities in some states where the state has sent the new CDBG money down to all of its jurisdictions. So in the last stimulus bill, the states got a ton of new CDBG money. And so I spoke to one jurisdiction in Pennsylvania or New York, I can't remember, Pennsylvania, I think, where they got a CDBG bucket of money, even though they're a very small jurisdiction. So I do wonder if there is some advocacy at the state level to get more of that funding out to smaller communities. But Melinda, you want to share a little bit about the question that you're asking?
I can. We are a small community of 11,000, and so much of what we're hearing from our small businesses is, we're a suburb of Kansas City, Missouri. Kansas City and Jackson County have opened up over $4 million in grant money, and they're doing all of these different things. Why aren't you doing the same? And we operate off of a general fund that is dependent on sales tax dollars, which we anticipate in the next 3 to 4 months going, quite frankly, in the toilet. And our businesses, our water users, our 3 largest water users have shut down, being our school, a major hotel with a spa, and a Job Corps. And so those have all shut down. So we've lost our revenue source, and we're in a lot of the same position that many of the small businesses are in. And so we're not finding that source, and we're not hearing back from our state representatives that those dollars are going to trickle down to us right now. So we're really dependent on the next go around with the federal government in hopes that they will open up some funding for small business that will be available to small businesses or small communities like ours, because we could go after USDA and EA funds, but we don't have an existing loan pool that we can pull that money into easily to quickly move to help save small business.
Right, and I think that it is. It is going to take some advocacy at the state level, but like you said, that's going to be very different than any resources that a community has right now. The reality is, though, if a city does not invest in its small businesses right now, even the technical assistance side, let alone the grant side, then there will be no economy to come back to afterwards, right? The backbone of all of this is our small businesses. So if a city says the money on it because we don't have revenues coming in, I think this is exactly why that all of these liquidities have been loosened from the Federal Reserve. And so there might be an opportunity for the city to take out emergency bonds or to get emergency bond funding through the state to be able to put out that funding, or to reach out to a broader United Way nonprofit community to provide some of the resources and support. I do think that funding through CDFIs or community banks, like Kennedy was talking about, could be a real savior for a community like yours that doesn't have those kinds of resources. And so that's an important thing to be thinking about. I've talked to a lot of communities where they think that it's an enormous hurdle to convince the local government to put any money into small businesses and to do it in any kind of inclusive way, right? And it's the most insane conversation I think I've ever had, which is, we don't have the money, we can't spend it, which I totally get. Every local government's budget is hemorrhaging. It's not some places, it's every place. But if you're starting with a smaller base and you're hemorrhaging money, then there's even less to be working with. And so I think that we have to look at these federal opportunities for loans and bonds to the municipality as well, just like we're asking a small business to do as well, and start looking at that. So that's a really, really great question. Francis, you talked about our being first responders for our small businesses. I think that's exactly what we need to do. I think we have to be calling every single small business. I also think we have to find the connectors in our community who can find our small businesses that might not be registered, because we have a lot of small business owners in a lot of communities that might be they may not have a business license, and they may not be able to get unemployment. And we still need to know who they are, and we still need to figure out how to help them. So that we can figure out what they actually need. And one of the things that I've been advocating communities to do is actually make a set of these phone calls to not all businesses at first, because that might be completely overwhelming, but pick 10 people each from different demographics and different types of businesses, and talk to them and find out what's going on and what they're missing and what they need, so that we can actually start crafting programs that fits exactly what they're saying, as opposed to guessing and sort of doing this hand waving about what all small business is. Still too general to make sure that we're doing this in an inclusive way. Taryn Smith, you talked about wanting to talk about this personal connection and support, especially with underserved communities, building trust. You want to share a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I think I was commenting on someone else's post about kind of going door to door and just reaching out to these businesses directly. I know, of course, I own 37 Oaks, and we focus on local commerce, innovation, and economic development, mostly here in Chicago, but across the US as well. So we work a lot with small businesses, mostly in our underserved communities and women-owned businesses. So we're seeing a lot of them, there's so much information out here, and you hit the nail on the head. There's so much information. They're kind of overwhelmed. They may not want to go out for more debt. They don't have, they may not be able to qualify for the loans. So they're kind of lost right now. They are shutting their doors. They're laying off people. Like it's not really a peachy situation. So sometimes having that one-on-one connection and that conversation as to what are my funding solutions based on my current situation, and not just sending them, a spreadsheet with links. Like, they need to really understand how to apply that to their current situation. And then I think we'd get a little bit more, sign on for some of these programs. But right now they're just totally overwhelmed. So I was just chiming in on the persons, whoever said that, and going door to door, talking to them, building the relationship, and helping them find solutions specifically for them.
Awesome, thank you. And then I think, Ed, if you can talk a little bit about the way you're starting to reposition your work. You said you're starting to look at not only fees you can waive, but also what kind of businesses you want to support and recruit in the future. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks, Ilana. I think maybe some context is I work in State College, PA, which is host community for Penn State. So we're dealing with the challenges of your company town, when the company shuts down, and then we'll come back later. So we have the benefit of it hopefully coming back later. But at this point, I think we recognize that we won't be back to business as usual until next year, and that means no football in the fall. So what that also means is that we've had a number of small businesses that were just barely hanging on for the last couple of years, and so they're gone, and we know they will be. So it's positioning for, well, what do we want to be next? And so I think as a staff member at the municipal level, the goal is how to bridge elected officials who have their perspectives on the business community, and that may not be grounded in reality, and how to bridge them and develop conversations with business owners so that they understand what the challenges really are. And then we can get to the point where, luckily, I work at a place that is willing to put local fund money into small business development. And we're hanging back just a little bit to make sure we don't roll something out that we're not ready to roll out. And that hence being here today is to listen to some of that. But I think the biggest challenge is building that trust and the understanding, and then being able to have some kind of community conversation. And I'm not sure what that looks like yet, that will position us to actively recruit for businesses in the future, because we're going to have a lot of vacancies. And instead of filling those with t-shirt shops and pizza parlors, we're looking to figure out how we recruit actual companies and build on small business base that will hopefully spin off from the university. So I guess that's where we're at, but we're looking for tools, and we've cobbled together about 200,000 as seed money. So now we're trying to figure out how we leverage that.
That's fantastic. I think that that direct line of communication with as many small businesses before you start releasing funds is an important piece if you can do it. Understanding if businesses are just closing up for good, or who is trying to stay in business. Some businesses can pause because they can do other kinds of work, and so the original thing that they were doing is okay to pause. I do think that we still need to come back to this original question of how do we do this in an inclusive way. I think that a lot of times I focus on downtowns with most of my work, or Main Street. When we have a downtown organization, a business improvement district or a corridor improvement district or a Main Street program, we have a limited number of businesses. We have a list, we can find them. When we're looking across a jurisdiction, there's just a lot more of them. And so making sure that we are working with partners to reach out and have these conversations, or have a standard questionnaire and have our partners ask these questions, and actually make the personal connection. I'm all for surveys in general that are online. They serve a role, but I think this is a time where people desperately need the personal touch and the personal connection, and working with a team of people to make a few dozen conversations and a few dozen phone calls, I think can make a really big difference for folks. And so that trust and that conversation becomes really, really essential. Bud shares the idea about patronicity, which is a great name. Bud, you want to share a little bit about what's going on with that? Are you still here? If you're on mute, there's so many. Okay, maybe we lost Bud. But people can check out Patronicity as a crowdfunding platform for localized crowdfunding. That they seems like they launched one for the greater Boston area. I think one of the questions that has come up a lot is this question of a diversified economy. And I do think that, I mean, during and after this, people, even before this, more communities have been talking about how to diversify an economy. So if you're very heavily invested in the tourism industry, obviously, as people noted here, you really have your legs swept out from underneath you. And so how are we going to come out of this looking at all of the different kinds of businesses that we've been able to help reframe and reshape, but then also really pushing hard on how to diversify the types of businesses in our community, and doing that in an inclusive way. I think that there's this really interesting question that Ed, you brought up and that I've been thinking about is about vacancies coming out of this. We know not every business is going to come back to every storefront. We also know that there'll be a shakeup in real estate. People who owned property before may not be the owners in the future. And so there's interesting questions about how do we fill those storefronts. There's interesting finance questions about how do we facilitate that, especially if a space has been empty for a year or a year and a half, depending on when we allow businesses to open again. And then there's, I think, interesting questions about how do we then purposefully do it in an inclusive way and say, we want this area to really represent the demographic diversity of our community. Let's go out and find local businesses, find businesses within our region that we want to have in our storefronts that really represent who we are and represent our personality. And that's something I talk about all the time, in case anybody ever wants to talk about it. But I do think that this is a unique challenge and a unique opportunity also to think about that going forward. Sean talks about that it's maybe more palatable politically for jurisdictions to think about supporting employee retention versus business owner subsidies. Sean, if you're still on, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So let me see if I can get my video working. It was a little, oh, there we go. Okay. I also want to make sure that Leslie Lambert is here too. Hi, Ilana, by the way. Nice to work with the other member of your family. So Leslie is on somewhere, and if she wants to unmute, I want to defer to her. We're on the Planning Commission in Santa Monica. Santa Monica is a city of about 93,000 that is seen as wealthy, but is disproportionately service-driven. So we've had a cratering of our transit occupancy tax and sales and use taxes, right? They're down something on the order of 80%. And unlike other sectors, those are not going to come back as reliably or as quickly over the next few months, dragging probably into about 2022. So we are also a deep blue city in terms of politics. And I think what we see politically is you have a conversation about property owners, you have a conversation about commercial tenants, and you have a conversation about employees. And within the conversation about commercial tenants, you also have a conversation about the national chains and the local businesses. And so echoing the points that we've heard in other conversations about housing, saying, look, the place we need to put the money is in the hands of the renters so that they can pay their rent and the system can stay stable, really, rather than doing big corporate subsidies. The same argument would be made here. Let's do everything that we can to keep everyone employed, to keep those supports in place. And in fact, it's an argument, I mean, I'm going to go way progressive here and say it's an argument toward universal income at some level, which some countries are now experimenting with in the short term.
Right.
But in a small city standpoint, if we look at supports, business retention supports, what those are going to do is we can target them so that they reward the companies, local or national, that keep their employees on the payroll, that try ways to keep their health insurance going, right. And essentially address core equity issues. Because of course, when we think of service workers in Santa Monica, the truth is we're thinking about people who are African American, Latino, and long-term, for many years on the wrong side of historical and structural racism, which, right. which needs to be named in this context.
And I think that I think that if we found a way to either provide the universal income, right? You wipe away all the questions, like whether or not the business is existing now or it comes back in 6 months or a year, like it becomes a non-issue because the business doesn't exist for people to survive, right? The baseline requirement of all of this is for people to be able to subsist and survive, pay their rent, pay their mortgage, pay for food, these basic things that I think that the universal income certainly would solve for. I think that then becomes this question of if you do it through the businesses, and I have no experience on this, and this is just from my brain doing this constantly, how do you do that with businesses that are service businesses that are not doing any business? And so all you're doing is then making that payment a more politically palatable pass-through to be a universal income versus just doing the universal income, which may not have any political standing, right? And so then it becomes this messy question of why are we doing this? One of the people I was speaking to, was asking that question, like if we just paid X dollars, if we looked at all of the money that we're likely to spend and lose on this, $20 trillion, like who knows what it's going to be? And we gave every person over the age of 18, $50,000, it would come out to be the same number more or less, or it might be less, I don't even know. And so then how are we looking at what is the right way to do this? And that's way beyond where we go today. But I think it's a really great question, Sean, that you bring up. And I think that my fear, honestly, is that the more we do this through businesses, the less inclusive we will be and the less equitable we will be in actually getting these resources to people who historically have been neglected by our systems, neglected and in fact turned away from our systems. And so I really think about, from this day going forward, how do we make sure that we're creating programs specifically to these populations so that they aren't being left behind. One of the rants and one of the talks that I give all the time is about all of the inequities that we had going into this crisis, right? The highest income inequality we've ever had in recorded history, a huge wealth gap, a racial wealth gap that isn't just because of historic inequities, but because of opportunities today for jobs that people have today. And so we're going into this with that reality, and how do we look at what we want to do during it and coming out of it to really change how we're working with people and how we're connecting with people, and those personal connections I think are an essential first step. And then understanding very specifically how we get the funding to people. One of the programs that I thought was really interesting, I think I didn't mention, is the New Orleans Relief Fund. The New Orleans Business Alliance created a fund aimed at their gig economy employees because it's like 10% of the whole adult population in New Orleans is gig economy. And so they created a fund where they're paying people over PayPal, right? You have to apply with certain documentation, but they're sending $500 out over PayPal, and you can reapply after 45 days. Now, it's not a lot of money, and it's over 45 days, but I think as a mechanism to really think about how do we focus on the populations that we think are going to be most in need. The LA program also, it's a swipe card, right? It's a way to automatically qualify and get funding into target communities. There's also a program in LA that's aimed at the vendors, the street vendors, and how does all of that come together? So, I mean, you're right there. So I imagine you know a lot more about that.
Can I just add one thing real fast for I think it was Melinda, who talked about her water users not paying their water fees. Just a quick point, which is that not every jurisdiction is going to feel the same tax loss, which means that if your water users are, say, schools or community colleges, is there something, now that they're not paying their water bill, is there something they could do with that money, like provide technical assistance to small businesses through their educational programs or apprenticeships for people or something, or training, something that the city could no longer afford to do, but maybe would be within the mission of a community college or a school district? That's like El Camino College in Torrance, California, we heard pivoted their small business development center into a technical assistance program.
Oh, that's great.
So just thinking about who are your partners in non-municipal partners who might not be feeling it as hard as you are, and so therefore might be able to pivot a bit.
John, thank you. That's a great idea. And I do think that community colleges overall are phenomenal partners. Somebody else wrote about Lee wrote about remembering to reach out to the local small business development center and SCORE. I think that these partnerships are essential. And thinking about the kitchen cabinet emergency response team, not just being the people in the local government, and not just the people at the Chamber of Commerce, and not just the people at the Economic Development Authority, but this diversity of people who are service providers, and really doing a triage list. And maybe I'll put out one of the tools that I use with communities all the time, which is this question of who are all of those connectors and players who are service providers that need to be at the table. And I think that looking at the way that they're not spending money and can spend money, or not using resources and can use resources, even to bring in an outside, expert that might be about e-commerce, like Taranda, who's on our call, to be a short-term class that they're not having somebody else teach, and how are they doing that? So I think that's a great idea. Carrie, you brought up just now about the school districts providing meals to low-income kids and family to keep their hourly staff, employees paid. I think that the essential ways that people are on the front lines in ways that I never even pictured imaginable, let alone our grocery workers and the people feeding the kids. I think is an enormous undertaking and responsibility. But Carrie, you want to also talk about briefly, I'm just going to call you out, the program that you guys passed in Columbia, Missouri, really focusing on underrepresented populations?
Our CDBG funding, yes. So right when this started, I got on the horn with we're an entitlement community, so CDBG funds come straight to us. We have a 5-year strategic plan. A lot of it's housing, but there's an economic development component as well. So they could, within the guidelines, immediately set aside $90,000 for forgivable loans to small businesses. They were under 5 employees, and there's a low and moderate income requirement. So either with the employees or with the owner. So it wasn't a lot, but it was what we could do immediately. That went live today. All the grants have been handed out. Very exciting. We're noticing some kind of micro barriers. For instance, CDBG funds required a DUN number, which is something that is difficult for people to get. So we're kind of learning from that process. We, in the next 45 days, we're going to take 400,000 of existing CDBG funds, take them out of housing. We understand housing is a need, but it's housing inspectors and a lot of high contact activities that were planned. took it out of that, and we're then going to introduce up to $30,000 low interest loans using CDBG funds. So it's a little more inclusive because the existing system is geared toward low and moderate income individuals. And that was kind of what we could do immediately.
Thank you. Sorry for putting you on the spot. You're coming. So this was great. I know we're just about out of time, but I just want to say thank you. Every piece of this that you guys share with me is helpful for me, and I hope is helpful for each other to be able to just get on an open call and have these conversations and share ideas. I will post this video. Hopefully I don't screw up the posting of this. So feel free to share it with other people that you think could use this kind of information. And part of what I'm going to work on doing is taking a lot of the ideas that you guys shared and try to turn it into a summary post for the blog on Recast City. If you ever want more information about all of the different resources, I've been working on tracking not only the federal programs as they go out, but also the state and local models, not all of them. Kennedy Smith is posting all of them, and she posted that link, and I can share it with folks, but I'm trying to share different models that we're seeing as they come out so that people can pull a model off the shelf and be able to move faster. I think that this question of how do we provide this assistance, both the grant assistance, the grant and loan assistance, as well as the technical assistance in an inclusive way to make sure we're reaching the demographic diversity of our communities, is really an essential one. I don't want us to move on and sort of wave our hands and say, well, it's too hard. I think this is something that we really need to double down on and say, this is important and we have to do this. And we have to do this in a really significant way. And we need to make sure that we're out in front. And you'll hear me talking about it more, and that it's not just about the demographic diversity within a community, it's also our diversity across the country. So how are we helping our small towns and cities, the rural areas? How are we making sure that people can survive this? And then what is that technical assistance that really will help people take the foundation of what they know to do and reshape its outside trappings so that they can become a viable and thriving business in what is going on today, in whatever will be the next version of who we are and where we are. So those are the big questions I leave you with today. I thank you all for taking the time to join me, and I look forward to talking to you all. If anybody wants any information about how to work with Recast City, or how we are helping folks through this, you all have my email address here in the chat. But you'll also all be getting emails from me from Recast City. And honestly, if you reply to any email that comes from Recast City, it comes directly to me. So I'm available to answer questions and help think through stuff. And if you want information about how Recast City is working with communities during this crisis to help save small business, it's at recastcity.com/COVID. I know, creative name. But we are here to help in any way that we can. So thank you all, and I hope to talk to you soon, and be well. Bye.